My name is Nora Eston. I'm 33 years old. And the Monday morning a paralegal named Cynthia Marsh called me from a title company I had never heard of was the morning I finally understood that being thorough is not the same thing as being included, but it turns out, the same thing as being necessary. Cynthia Marsh introduced herself as a closing coordinator at Alderton Title and Escrow. She said she was calling in connection with a residential lakefront property listed under the Eston family estate. She said she had been trying to reach the co-executor of record for 4 business days and had not received a response, and that she required a notarized consent form from me before the transaction could proceed. She asked if I was available to come in before end of business Tuesday. Closing was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I asked her to hold for a moment. I set the phone down on my kitchen counter. I looked at the window above the sink, at the particular flat gray of a November morning. Then I picked the phone back up and told her I would need 24 hours to review the relevant documents before I could make any commitments about Tuesday. She said that would create a timing issue. I said I understood. What none of them had considered, what my brother, Owen Eston, had apparently not thought to verify in the 8 months he had been managing the sale of our father's lake house, was that our father had restructured the estate 2 years before his death. Quietly, deliberately, with the help of his attorney. And the restructuring had put my name somewhere that made Tuesday's closing impossible without me. The lake house has been in our family since 1987, when my father, Raymond Eston, bought a 7-acre parcel on the eastern shore of Carver Lake from a retired schoolteacher who was moving to be near her daughter. The property had an existing structure, a 2-bedroom cabin with a screened porch and a foundation that needed work, and my father spent the better part of 3 summers improving it. He replaced the foundation. He re-sided the exterior. He built the dock himself, plank by plank, the summer I turned 9. I remember holding the level for him while he checked the crossbeams, and him telling me that a thing built right the first time saves you from building it twice. Raymond Eston was a civil engineer by profession and a methodical person by disposition. He kept files. He kept records. He kept a maintenance log for the lake house that dated back to 1991 and included entries for every repair, every inspection, every permit pulled, and every permit renewed. When he retired in 2014, he began spending more time at the property, driving out on Thursday evenings and returning Sunday afternoons, sometimes staying longer in the summer. He was not a sentimental man in the way that gets expressed easily, but the lake house was the place where his sentimentality lived quietly, in the dock he had built and the maintenance log he had kept, and the way he knew the name of every neighbor within a half-mile of the shore. Owen is 5 years older than me. He lives 40 minutes from where we grew up, works in commercial insurance, and has a ease in rooms that I have never had and never tried to develop. He is the kind of person who makes a strong first impression and relies on it. He was closer to our father in the way that oldest children sometimes are, not because of any particular depth of understanding but because of proximity and repetition, because he had 5 years of our father's full attention before I arrived, and had built a shorthand with him that I spent my childhood watching without quite being able to enter. I am a licensed property and casualty insurance adjuster. I have been doing this work for 9 years, first at a regional firm, and then for the past 4 years, independently. The work is procedural and requires precision, reading policy language carefully, identifying what is covered and what is excluded, catching the gaps between what people assume a document says and what it actually says. My father understood this work in a way that Owen never bothered to. My father understood that the people who read the fine print are not being difficult. They are being accurate. When my father's health began declining in the fall of 2019, a diagnosis that his internist, Dr. Philip Osei, described as manageable but requiring consistent monitoring, I became the one who handled the administrative layer of the lake house. Not because anyone asked me to, because it needed doing, and I was the one who noticed. I renewed the property insurance through a broker named Gerald Fitch at Lakeshore Coverage Associates, a policy that required annual review given the waterfront classification and the dock liability rider. I filed the annual property tax appeal 2 years running, working with a county assessor's office contact named Beverly Crane, and reduced the assessed value both times by a combined total of $11,400 over the 2 years, savings that went directly back into the property maintenance fund my father kept in a dedicated account. I coordinated the dock inspection required by the county every 3 years, scheduled through a licensed marine inspector named Dale Whitmore, who found 2 planks that needed replacing in 2021 and whose written report I filed in the same cabinet where my father kept his maintenance log. Owen knew I handled these things. He said once at a family dinner that it was good I had the time for it. I did not respond to that. My father died in March of the following year, at 71, from complications that his cardiologist, Dr. Anita Farrow, had been monitoring for 18 months. He died at home on a Thursday morning with my mother present. I drove out that afternoon. Owen arrived that evening from a work trip he cut short. The estate was not large. The primary assets were the family home, which my mother continues to occupy, and the lake house, which was the significant piece. My father had worked with his estate attorney, a thorough man named Edmund Castellan, to prepare a will and an accompanying estate structure that he had last updated in the spring 2 years before his death. I knew about the will in general terms. I did not know, until Cynthia Marsh called me on a Monday morning, the specific mechanism Edmund Castellan had put in place at my father's direction. What Edmund Castellan had done, at my father's explicit instruction, was name me as co-executor of the estate alongside Owen. Not a beneficiary adjustment. The beneficial interests remained equally distributed between Owen and me, with provisions for our mother. The co-executor designation meant that any transaction involving estate assets required both our consents and both our signatures. It was a procedural safeguard, the kind that a methodical man who had spent his life in engineering, where a second set of eyes on a structural decision is not a courtesy but a requirement, would think to put in place. Edmund Castellan had sent a letter to both Owen and me when the updated documents were filed. I had received mine, read it, filed it in the folder I keep for my father's affairs, and noted the co-executor designation without thinking much about it because at the time my father was alive and the designation was a contingency. Owen, apparently, had received his letter and either not read it carefully or not retained what it said. He had spent 8 months managing a sale of an estate asset without consulting the co-executor of record. The title company had been trying to reach me for 4 business days before Cynthia Marsh made the call that reached me on a Monday. I should tell you about the lake house in the way that matters for this story, which is not the way you describe a property to a buyer, but the way you describe a place that has accumulated meaning over decades of specific use. The screened porch faces west, toward the water. On clear evenings, the light comes off the lake at an angle that turns the surface copper for about 20 minutes before it goes flat. My father used to sit on that porch with a cup of coffee after dinner and watch the light change. I sat with him sometimes, when I visited on weekends, and we talked about whatever was practical, the dock, the insurance, the neighbor 2 properties down who kept encroaching on the shared access path, and sometimes we sat without talking about anything at all. The dock is 62 feet long. My father measured it. It is in the maintenance log, entry dated August 14, 1994, the summer after he finished it. Dock complete, 62 feet from shore to end, 4 feet wide, pressure-treated pine, dual cleats port and starboard. He updated the entry every time a plank was replaced, noting the date, the plank location, and the material used. The most recent entry was from the inspection Dale Whitmore completed in 2021. I had made that entry myself, in my own handwriting, because my father's hands had begun to shake slightly by then, and he had asked me to write it for him. Owen listed the lake house in February. I know this because the listing is public record, and because a former neighbor of my parents, a woman named Harriet Good, mentioned it to my mother in passing at a church function in March, and my mother mentioned it to me on the phone a week later in a way that suggested she assumed I already knew. I told her I was aware of the situation, which was not true at the time but became true within the hour, when I pulled up the county property records and found the listing. I did not call Owen. I called Edmund Castellan's office and left a message for his associate, a woman named Priya Nambiar, who handled active estate matters for the firm. Priya Nambiar called me back the following morning and confirmed what I needed to know. As co-executor, I was a required signatory on any transaction involving estate assets. The listing itself did not require my prior consent in every jurisdiction, but the closing absolutely did. No title company could complete the transfer without my notarized signature on the consent and authorization form. She also confirmed that she had not been contacted by Owen or by any broker or title company in connection with the listing. Edmund Castellan's office had not been brought into the transaction at all. Owen had apparently been working directly with a real estate agent, a man named Scott Bellamy, at a firm called Ridgeline Property Group, and had represented to Ridgeline and to the buyer that he had authority to act on behalf of the estate without qualification. He was the executor, after all. He just wasn't the only one. I thanked Priya Nambiar. I made a note of the call. I did not contact Owen. The listing had been active for 6 weeks when an offer came in from a buyer, a couple, represented in the paperwork by their attorney, a man named Thomas Weil. The offer was $487,000, which was within the range that Scott Bellamy had assessed as fair market value for a 7-acre lakefront parcel in that area. Owen had accepted the offer. The accepted price was $487,000. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, 8 months after the listing went live. Cynthia Marsh had been trying to reach me for 4 business days before she succeeded. I want to tell you exactly what happened when I called Owen because the conversation is relevant to everything that followed. I called him on Monday afternoon, 4 hours after I spoke with Cynthia Marsh. I had spent those 4 hours on 2 calls. One with Priya Nambiar to confirm the procedural specifics, one with my own attorney, a woman named Sandra Quill, who specialized in estate and property matters and who took a consultation call the same afternoon I reached out. Sandra Quill was direct. She told me my position was unambiguous. She told me the closing could not proceed without my signature and that I was under no obligation to provide that signature on any particular timeline. She told me that if I chose to withhold consent, the buyer would have recourse against the estate for breach of the purchase agreement, and that recourse would land primarily on the executor, who had represented the estate as having clear authority to transact, which was Owen. She used the phrase misrepresentation of authority and explained what it meant in practical terms. I made notes. I thanked her. I called Owen at 3:15 in the afternoon. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting a call from someone, though probably not from me. I told him I had spoken with Cynthia Marsh at Alderton Title and Escrow. There was a pause. Then he said the title company had been having trouble locating some paperwork and that it was being handled. I said I was aware of what they were having trouble locating. Another pause. Longer. He said, "Nora, closing is tomorrow." I said, "I know." He said the buyer had already arranged financing. He caught himself because the offer was cash. He said the buyer had already made arrangements, had already given notice on their current place, that this had been in process for 8 months, that everything was agreed. I said, "I understand." He asked what I needed to sign off. I told him I needed to speak with Edmund Castellan's office, with him present, before I made any decisions. I told him I needed the full transaction file. The listing agreement, the purchase agreement, all addenda, the commission structure, the proposed closing statement. I told him I needed 48 hours. He said 48 hours would blow the closing. I said, yes. The line was quiet for long enough that I counted the seconds. I got to 9 before he spoke again. He said, "Dad would have wanted this sold." I said, "Dad would have wanted both of us at the table." I ended the call. I sat at my desk in the room I use as an office and looked at the folder I keep for my father's affairs. The maintenance log was not in that folder. It was still at the lake house, in the cabinet where my father had kept it since 1991. But I had photographed every page of it the last time I was out there, 18 months before my father died, during one of the weekends I spent going through the administrative files. The photographs were in a subfolder on my laptop labeled with the property address and the year. I did not call anyone else that evening. The 48 hours I asked for were not 48 hours of inaction. On Monday evening I drove to Edmund Castellan's office. He had agreed, through Priya Nambiar, to make himself available given the circumstances, and spent 90 minutes reviewing the transaction file that his office had obtained through a formal request to Ridgeline Property Group. Scott Bellamy had provided the file promptly, in a way that suggested he understood the situation was more complicated than his client had represented. The listing agreement had been signed by Owen alone, in his capacity as executor, with no reference to the co-executor designation. The purchase agreement was similarly structured. The closing statement, prepared by Alderton Title and Escrow, had a signature block for the estate that referenced Owen as sole executor. Edmund Castellan reviewed each document with me, patiently and without drama. He is the kind of attorney who does not use more words than necessary, which I find useful. He confirmed that every document in the file had been executed or prepared on the basis of Owen's representation that he had sole authority to transact. He confirmed that Ridgeline and Alderton Title had done standard due diligence, but had relied on the executor's representation without independently pulling the estate filing. He said this was not uncommon. He said it was, however, a problem. He used the word exposure and explained it in terms that I recognize from my own work. The way a representation made to a counterparty creates liability when the representation turns out to be incomplete. I asked him what he recommended. He said that was my decision to make. He laid out the options the way a methodical person lays out options, clearly, in sequence, without editorial comment. I could sign the consent form and allow the closing to proceed, in which case the transaction would complete and the proceeds would be distributed per the estate terms, with my share going to me as beneficiary. I could sign the consent form contingent on conditions, a restructured closing statement, a formal acknowledgement of the co-executor designation in the transaction record, a review of the commission arrangement. Or I could decline to sign, in which case the closing would fail, the buyer would have legal recourse against the estate, and the liability for misrepresentation of authority would attach to the executor who had made that misrepresentation. He was very clear that the third option created consequences that I would not be controlling. He was very clear that those consequences were the direct result of how the transaction had been structured by Owen and by no one else. I told him I needed to sleep on it. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at the table where my father used to sit when he visited my apartment, which he did 4 or 5 times a year, and I thought about the doc and the maintenance log and the entry in my own handwriting from 2021, and I thought about what it means to build something right the first time. I called Sandra Quill in the morning and told her my decision. My conditions were 3. The first was that the closing statement be reissued to correctly reflect the co-executor structure of the estate, with both Owen's name and mine appearing in the estate representative capacity. This was not punitive. It was accurate. The estate record should reflect how the estate was actually constituted. The second was that a formal acknowledgement be prepared, signed by Owen and countersigned by Edmund Castellan's office, confirming that the co-executor designation had been in place throughout the listing period and that future transactions involving estate assets would be managed with appropriate notice to both co-executors. This was prospective. There were no other estate assets of significance, but I wanted the record to be clean. The third was that the closing be rescheduled for a date no sooner than 10 business days from Monday, to allow Edmund Castellan's office time to review the reissued documents and for me to have independent review time with Sandra Quill. I did not ask for a change to the purchase price. I did not ask for a redistribution of proceeds. I did not ask for anything beyond what the co-executor designation entitled me to: proper notice, proper documentation, and proper time. Sandra Quill drafted the conditions letter and sent it to Thomas Weil, the buyer's attorney, with copies to Edmund Castellan, Scott Bellamy at Ridgeline, and Cynthia Marsh at Alderton Title. The letter went out Tuesday morning, 2 hours before the scheduled closing time. The closing did not happen on Tuesday. Thomas Weil called Sandra Quill within the hour. He was professional and measured, the way buyers' attorneys tend to be when they understand that the problem is not with the party they are calling. He had reviewed the estate filing independently after Cynthia Marsh's failed outreach, and he had identified the co-executor designation himself. His call to Sandra Quill was not adversarial. It was, essentially, a confirmation that his client wanted the property and was prepared to wait for a correctly structured closing, provided the timeline was defined. Sandra Quill called me after. She said Thomas Weil had used the phrase "appropriately positioned" to describe my conditions, which she said was attorney language for reasonable. The buyer agreed to the rescheduled closing. Scott Bellamy communicated this to Owen. Owen called me that evening. The call lasted 6 minutes. He asked if I understood what I had put the buyer through. I said I understood the buyer had agreed to proceed. He said the delay was going to cost him, He meant in terms of his own timeline, some arrangement he had made contingent on the proceeds, which I did not ask him to detail. I said I was sorry the timing was difficult. He said, "You always have to make everything complicated." I said, "Dad named 2 executors." I ended the call. The closing was rescheduled for a date 17 days after the original Tuesday. Edmund Castellan's office prepared the reissued closing statement. Sandra Quill reviewed it on my behalf. The acknowledgement document was prepared and signed. Owen signed it without additional comment, which Edmund Castellan's office conveyed to Sandra Quill in a brief email. On the rescheduled closing date, the lake house transferred to its new owners for $487,000. The net proceeds after commission and closing costs came to $451,340. Scott Bellamy's commission, at the agreed rate, was $29,220. Edmund Castellan's additional fees for the co-executor coordination were billed to the estate and deducted before distribution. My share of the net proceeds, per the estate terms, was distributed to me within the standard settlement window. The buyer's attorney, Thomas Weil, sent a formal closing confirmation to both executors. The document had both our names on it. I kept it in my father's folder. I want to tell you about the day I drove out to the lake house before the closing because I think it belongs in this story. I went on a Wednesday, 8 days before the rescheduled close. I used the key from the lockbox combination that Scott Bellamy had provided to all parties, and I let myself in through the side door, the one that opens into the kitchen, where my father kept his coffee in the cabinet above the percolator he had used since 1998. I walked through the house room by room, not quickly. The furniture that was staying had been staged by Scott Bellamy's team, impersonal arrangements designed to suggest possibility rather than history. The furniture that was going had been removed by Owen in the summer, divided between his house and a storage unit, without a conversation with me about any of it. I had not contested this. The furniture was not the significant piece. I went out through the screened porch to the dock. It was a cold morning, mid-November, and the lake was flat and very dark. I walked the full 62 feet to the end of the dock and stood there for a while. The 2 planks that Dale Whitmore had flagged in 2021 had been replaced. I had arranged that repair, scheduled the contractor, confirmed the work. The dock was solid underfoot. I walked back to the house. I went to the cabinet in the main bedroom where my father had kept the maintenance log, and I took it out. It was a standard 3-ring binder, green, with a label on the spine in my father's handwriting, Carver Lake, Property Maintenance. I sat on the floor of the empty bedroom with the binder in my lap and turned through the pages. 31 years of entries. His handwriting through most of it, mine in the last few pages. I did not take the binder. It was an estate asset, and removing it before closing would have been inappropriate. I photographed the final page, the 2021 entry in my handwriting, and then I put the binder back in the cabinet, exactly where my father had kept it. The buyers would find it when they moved in. I thought about what they would make of it. 31 years of a man's careful attention to a place he had built and maintained and loved in the way that methodical people love things, through consistency and precision, and showing up. I hoped they would keep it. I locked the side door behind me and drove home. The months after the closing were unremarkable in the way that resolutions tend to be unremarkable once the mechanism has completed. Owen and I did not have a direct conversation about the estate matter for nearly 2 months. When we did speak, at a family gathering at our mother's house in January, it was brief and civil in the way of people who have reached the end of an argument and are not interested in resuming it. My mother, Eleanor Eston, had understood more of what had happened than either Owen or I had told her directly. She is not a person who asks for explicit information when she can infer it, and she had inferred most of it from the timeline, from the gap between when the closing was supposed to happen and when it actually happened, from the way Owen had been terse on the phone with her in November, from the way I had not been terse but had been, as she put it, very focused. She asked me once, directly, whether I had done what I thought was right. I told her yes. She said, "Your father would have said the same thing." She did not say it as a compliment or a verdict. She said it as a statement of fact, the way she says most things, and then she changed the subject to the January weather and whether the roads were likely to be bad on the drive home. I received my portion of the estate proceeds in the standard settlement window. I used a portion of it to establish a small fund in my father's name at the County Historical Society, which maintains records of the area's early residential and lakefront development, the kind of records my father would have found genuinely interesting. The fund is modest, $7,500, designated for the maintenance and digitization of property and land use records from the 1970s through the 1990s. Edmund Castellan's office handled the establishment paperwork. I did not tell Owen about the fund. It was mine to establish and mine to name. The Historical Society sent a confirmation letter addressed to me, with my father's name in the designated field. I put it in his folder. My work as an insurance adjuster continued, without interruption, through all of this. In the months around the estate matter, I handled 14 active claims, 3 of which involved waterfront properties, and 1 of which required a dock assessment that I coordinated with a marine inspector named Roy Featherstone, who works the same county where Carver Lake sits. Roy Featherstone has never heard of my family or the Carver Lake property, but when I walked the dock with him on that claim and he pointed out 2 planks that needed attention, I told him I knew what to look for, and he showed me exactly what he meant. My supervising contact at the regional carrier I work with most frequently, a claims director named Leah Ambrose, reviewed my work on a complex roof and structural claim last spring and noted in her written assessment that my documentation was, in her words, unusually complete. I filed that assessment. I find I am filing more things now, not fewer. Owen was recently promoted at his firm. I know this because he mentioned it at our mother's house in March, in passing, in the way you mention things you want acknowledged, without quite asking for acknowledgement. I told him that was good news. He nodded. We talked about our mother's plans for the summer. It was a normal conversation of the kind that families have when they have established, without saying so directly, that certain things have been settled. They have been settled. Not because I demanded settlement. Because the paperwork settled it, the way paperwork does when it was filed correctly, and by someone who knew what he was doing. My father knew what he was doing. I have thought about the maintenance log more than I expected to. I have thought about what it means to keep a record of a thing, not for any audience, not for any eventual reader, but because the record itself is a form of attention. 31 years of entries that nobody was required to make. A standard green binder in a cabinet in a bedroom of a house that no longer belongs to our family. The new owners have been there for several months now. I do not know what they have done with the binder. I hope, as I said, that they kept it. What I know is what my father believed, and what working with documents for 9 years has confirmed for me, a record that is complete and accurate, and on file does not require anyone to believe in it. It simply is. When the moment comes that requires it, the title search, the co-executor designation, the closing statement, it is already there. It has been there the whole time. It was never about the moment. It was about the filing. The people who skip the filing are not bad people. They are people who believe that things will resolve in their favor because they have always resolved in their favor. They believe that the details are someone else's department. They believe that the estate is uncomplicated because no one has told them otherwise. What changes is not their nature. What changes is the moment the title company calls. Before you go, I want to ask you something that I have been thinking about since the closing. Edmund Castellan told me, in the 90 minutes we spent in his office on Monday evening, that my father had been specific in the co-executor instruction. He had not simply named me as a safeguard. He had told Edmund that he wanted someone on the estate who had read the documents. He used that phrase, Edmund said. Someone who will read the documents. My father had watched me my entire adult life do exactly that. He had watched me file the tax appeals and review the insurance policy and photograph the maintenance log. He had asked me to write the final entry in my handwriting when his hands were shaking. Here is my question for you. When Edmund Castellan told me what my father had said, that phrase, someone who will read the documents, and I was sitting across from him in that office on a Monday evening, 22 hours before a closing that was already not going to happen, what do you think I did with that information in the moment? Did I ask Edmund to repeat it? Did I write it down? Or did I just sit with it quietly for a few seconds and then get back to the transaction file? Tell me in the comments. I think you probably know the answer. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. New stories every week, and I always read the long comments. Take care of yourselves.